Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the late title Tuesday played today, September 24th of the great year 2024. Now, many top players showed up for this event, including the five-time world champion Magnus Carlsen, myself, Nihal Sarin, Fabiano Caruana, and of course, the future first American world champion, Hans Niemann. Now, Hans got off to a really good start, winning his first 5 games, and in the 6th round, we got the big matchup that everyone was waiting for between Magnus and Hans. Now, those of you guys who were following the Speed Chess Championship, which was played a couple of weeks ago in Paris, you might remember that Hans was a lot of bluster, saying he was going to beat everybody, be the best blitz player in the world. Unfortunately for Hans, he got soundly demolished by Magnus, and of course myself as well, and it wasn't meant to be for him. But a couple weeks removed, we're back playing chess, and let's jump right into the action. So as I mentioned, both players with 5 points out of 5 games, and Magnus has the white pieces. Game starts with the move knight to f3. We get the move d5 from Hans, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, and now we get the move g6. Now, in the Speed Chess Championship, Hans actually played a lot of these systems with e6 and bishop e7 against both Magnus and myself, and he did quite poorly. So today he obviously was well prepared and wanted to play a different setup. We get g6. Magnus goes b3. We get bishop g7, bishop b2. And here Magnus has played the classic double fianchetto with the bishops on b2 and g2. Hans decides to play the move c5. We get c4, d4, and now we have the move b4 being played. Now, this is what is known as the classic Ben-Oni structure, where black or white get the pawns on d4, c5, or for white, you get the pawns, or if you're playing from the opposite side, or you're playing from the other side, sorry, I should say, white gets the pawns on c4 and d5 versus d6 and c5. So here we get b4 from Magnus trying to chip away at this black center here, hitting the pawn on c5. Hans decides to play knight c6, and now we get the move b5, knight to b8, and here the move castles is played. Hans castles, and now we get the move e3. Now, what Magnus is trying to do here is, again, he's trying to break up this chain of 2 pawns here. Additionally, if black does take, like in the game, now white has the option to play either d3 or d4 to contest the center. And additionally, the one big issue black has is that this bishop and knight are a little bit misplaced. If black could magically get b6 and bishop b7 here, for example, to oppose the bishop on g2, black would be doing fine. But if you go b6, now white can play the move knight to e5, and it's spaghetti-o time, as your rook on 8 in the corner will fall on the next turn or two. So after f takes e3, we get the move knight bd7 from Hans. Magnus now plays the move a4. We get knight to b6, and here we have the move knight a3 being played. Now, you will notice the computer does not like knight a3. It wants Magnus to play queen b3. Now, in a blitz game, it's very understandable why Magnus did not play this move. He's moving very quickly, because after bishop to e6, suddenly it feels like your queen is on this diagonal. The pawn on c4 is weak. If you ever go d3, maybe there's bishop h6, maybe there's knight g4. The pawns in the center of the board here feel a little bit brittle, and unless you're going to spend a certain amount of time, it's going to be very difficult to figure out what the best reply is. So Magnus decides to play quickly. He goes knight to a3, guarding the pawn on c4, and now Hans plays the move a5. Now, this move is completely reasonable from Hans. Computer actually thinks after bishop to f5, trying to go for bishop d3, black is apparently a little bit better after d4 and knight fd7, because now black's b's are slightly better than the double fianchetto here, or at least they are according to the computer. Actually, that's knight bd7, not knight fd7. My apologies. At any rate, let's keep going. So Hans instead plays move a5, and this is a very aggressive move because now white has an issue where the knight on a3 is kind of misplaced. It guards the pawn on c4 and b5 potentially, but it doesn't have any active squares to get to the center, and now black's knight here on b6 is targeting both of these pawns at the same time. So Magnus goes for the move d4 here. Hans plays knight to g4, attacking the pawn on e3 and opening up the scope for the b on g7. Magnus plays queen to e2, and now we get the move bishop to h6 being played. Now, you will notice the computer here says that black can play knight takes a4, and if Hans had played knight takes a4, there is a very good chance he would have won the game, because out of nowhere, white is missing a pawn on the edge. Additionally, the center is very, very brittle here, and your bishop on b2 is under attack. A sample line, say bishop c1, I can simply take, and it's spaghetti-o time. The king is in check, the rook is hanging, your bishop e3, I just trade it all off. I have an extra horse, and I win the game. So, somehow, Hans misses the move. He plays bishop h6 here, which is just really, frankly, unconscionable. With 2 minutes and 27 seconds in this position, you expect him to find better. But I do think that Hans, for all his bluster, sometimes he does feel the effects. And this is a clear example of what we call the classic Magnus effect. Not to be confused with physics, by the way, but there is a real term in physics that is called the Magnus effect, but we are talking about chess here. And Hans just misses it. He plays bishop h6 instead, and now after knight to c2, Magnus is completely fine again. because the rook guards the pawn on a4, the queen guards the pawn on c4, and now the knight on c2 guards his pawn on e3 from being captured. So just like that, Hans Niemann has missed his chance at glory, and he's in a little bit of trouble here. So we got to move pawn takes pawn. Magnus plays bishop takes pawn, and now we get to move queen c7, and here Magnus goes c5, attacking the horse on b6. Hans plays knight to d5, and now we get to move rook a d1, and at this point, black is in a little bit of trouble here, primarily because the knights here in the center and on the edge are a little bit loose. They can easily be kicked away. h3 and e4 exists here. White also can start pushing p on the queen side due to this 3-on-2 majority. So both of these issues make it very tough to play. So Hans goes bishop to e6, trying to guard the knight and developing the bishop so the rooks can come to the center. Magnus plays b6 here. We get to move queen c8, and now the move knight e2 is played. Now, this is another blunder from Magnus out of thin air in this position. Maybe Magnus is feeling a little bit of that future first American world champion effect here because he does not find the right move. In this position, what Magnus should have played is a quiet move like rook d to e1, and then decided later whether to play h3 or move the knight around the board. There might even be a knight a3 idea as well, but white is better. Instead, we get knight to d2, and now Hans misses his chance when he plays knight g f6. Now, in this position, if Hans were sharper, he would have seen knight takes pawn here, because if white takes the knight, you lose the horse on c2, and after bishop b7 and rook a d8, black is completely fine here. Pawn on e3 is a serious weakness, and the pawn on a4 as well, so black is probably better. Instead, Hans Niemann plays move knight to f6, and now Magnus goes knight c4, stopping this knight to b6 idea. Now, at this point, Magnus has achieved the optimal setup. He's got the wooden shield in the middle of the board, the bishop on d4 here. He has the other b on this long diagonal. He's got these pawns as well, so he's going to try to force something through, and these knights can even be improved a little bit as well. At any rate, it's looking very bad. So Hans goes rook d8, Magnus plays knight to e5 here, a nice move stopping knight g4 potentially, and also creating space for the other knight to jump to either c4, b5. Hans plays knight g4, we get to move knight, takes, and now we have to move queen c4. Now, this is simply a mistake from Magnus. Very hard to understand why he did not play the move queen to f2, threatening checkmate in Uno, because if black takes the rook, you have queen takes f7, and it's simply GG. Magnus instead goes queen g4, sacking the rook once again, and now we get to move bishop e6. Now, it's pretty clear at this point in the game that Hans is suffering the effects of Magnus, because if he weren't suffering the effects, he would simply play bishop takes rook, and after bishop takes d5, threatening to use the double B combo on these diagonals, you can simply go e6 here, and black is completely fine. Instead, Hans goes bishop e6, begging for a draw, but Magnus is having none of it, and he plays to move queen b5. Hans plays bishop d7, and now we get to move queen b3, another mistake in the position from Magnus. He could have sacked the queen with bishop takes knight, and after bishop takes queen, bishop takes pawn, king to f8. In this position, you have the very nice move bishop c4, creating the fossil. You check the king, and now if black blocks with the queen, you take and take the bishop, and you have two b's for a rook, and you should be winning. And if black goes king to e8 here, now you can play bishop takes bishop, checking the king. No squares available on the f-file. No. You have to play rook to d7, and now white can go bishop to e5, and suddenly the fossil and the pin, everything plays here, and black is just completely lost in this position. Instead, Magnus plays the move queen to b3, and now we get bishop e6. We have queen b2, and here Hans plays the move f6. Now Magnus goes e4, and at this point, the dust is somewhat settled. f6 is a mistake, by the way. The computer says after bishop g4, black is still fine. But whoops, I did not mean to do that. My apologies. Sorry about that. That is really unfortunate. Spoiler alert, ha. So after f6, we get to move e4 being played, and after knight b4 takes, and queen b4, now white is up one pawn on the queen side, and Hans is in all kinds of trouble. We get bishop g4, now we have to move bishop to f3, we got takes, and Hans plays the move e5, desperately trying to win the b on d4 with the pin. Magnus plays queen to b3, checking the king, but more importantly, guarding the rook on d1. We get king h8, and now we have to move bishop f2. Hans trades the rooks, and now he goes bishop g7, trying to guard the pawn. But at this point, the game is simply lost. White has a 3-on-1 majority on the queen side. White's going to create a passed pawn and push p, and black really has nothing happening on the king side. Magnus plays king g2. We get the move f5, queen d5, f4, and here the move rook b3 is played. Now, Magnus showing great technique here. His plan is very simple. He wants to push p on the queen side. He wants to put the rook behind this pawn so that when he sacks, he can just push the b pawn to b7 and potentially b8. Hans goes g5, we get c6, takes, and now Magnus plays the move queen to f7. You'll see quite clearly here, white has the two pawns. Magnus simply pushing p in Hans's face, and there's really nothing Hans can do here other than lose the game. Hans plays queen to e8. We get the trade. And now after b7, we get rook b8, rook to b8, a7 or a5 is played here. Bishop to a7 would be winning, by the way, as well. But Magnus just wants to push p, a6, a7. And after rook takes b7, rook takes rook. Hans Niemann resigns this game, and Magnus gets a big win to move to 6 out of 6. Now, in round number 7, I actually was also on 6 points out of 6. I would play with the white piece against Vincent Keimer. I would lose that game, meaning that I was a point behind Magnus going into the 8th round, when sure enough, we have Magnus and I playing. I think 8th round or 9th round. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm doing this recap live, of course, so I'm not 100% sure. But at any rate, going into this 9th round, Magnus on a perfect score, 8 out of 8. I'm 1 point behind on 7 out of 8, but I am in a tie for 2nd place. So I have the black piece against Magnus like every Title Tuesday recently, and the game starts with knight f3. I go d5, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, and now Magnus plays the move d4. In our last encounter on Title Tuesday, Magnus castled, and after e5, I obtained a big black center. I was under some pressure in that game, but it ended in a draw. Today, Magnus instead plays d4. He's not in the mood to face a big black center, and now I play the move knight d7. Magnus castles, and here I play the move knight gf6. We get knight bd2, knight bd2, c5, c4, and now I castle. Now, at this point, we're playing the classic mirror, mirror on the wall. Who's the fairest of them all? As you'll notice, we have an exact mirror. All of our pieces are on the identical squares in this position. Magnus decides to break the symmetry by taking on d5. I play knight takes pawn, and now we get the move e4. Here I play the move knight b4, and now Magnus spends a long time, nearly 1 full minute here before playing the move a3. Now, I'm not sure whether knight b4 was a move that caught Magnus off guard or what was going on, but to me in this position, when we reached it, I thought, you know what, I just got to move quickly. If I get low on time, bad things are going to happen. So I played this move pretty quickly, and Magnus spent a lot of time because I think he was very unhappy with the position. White were to play d5 here in this position, I can go b5 followed by c4 and knight d3, building a nice bastion in the center of the board. One sample line would be like queen e2, c4, and let's just say rook d1, knight d3, and all of a sudden, not only do I have a connect 3, but I've got a great bastion. I've got this nice diagonal for my fianchetto bishop on g7. So after knight b4, Magnus plays a3, I go knight to d3, and at this point, it's clear that I'm going to have the 2 b's, but Magnus is most likely going to have a big white center if he plays it a certain way. Magnus plays the move knight c4. I take, he takes, I take on d4. And here Magnus plays this move e5. Now, I think that Magnus has spent a lot of time here, so he didn't want to get below a minute, didn't want to get too low on time, which is what led to this decision. Computer actually prefers queen e2, and after takes, rook a c1. Let's just say I take e5, knight b6 here. Now white can go queen d3 and win the pawn on d4, and white should be fine. Now, the reason I mention this line is because it's going to be very similar, or we're going to be able to contrast this to another setup that occurs in the game. So after knight after knight d3, knight c4 takes, Magnus plays the move e5 here. Now, if Magnus were to take on d4, I can quite simply go knight to b6 here, opening up the threats towards the knight on d4, creating a bit of a fossil here. And if white tries to move the knight to f3, after takes, bishop b2, I'm simply up a clean pawn here. I still have the 2 b's on the board, and it's very bad for white. Now, if Magnus were to trade the horses on b6, after takes, I have the classic double attack of the knight and the pawn on b2 at the same time. There's also a classic right triangle, 90 degrees as well, and I can bring the rook to the center of the board, and white's in a lot of trouble. So that's why Magnus plays the move e5 here. I go knight b6, knight a5, knight d7, knight c4, knight b6, knight a5, and this is where I have a very tough decision. Now, the tough decision here is, do I play knight to d7 and make the draw, or do I play for more? Now, I think that if both of us were on 8 points out of 8, or say 7.5 out of 8, there's a very good chance that I would make the repetition and take the draw. But in this situation, a draw is simply not good enough. I have to try to go for more. So I spent a lot of time here before playing the move bishop h6, nearly 1 minute. Now, I'm lucky that I spotted this move, because actually I was very close to simply making the repetition. But as the old saying goes from the great old language that's no longer live, it's, I think, fortis fortuna juvat. That is the saying, which is, of course, fortune favors the bull. So I decided to play on here, and I find the best move, which is bishop to h6. This is not an easy move to find at all. The initial move that I considered here was to play the move knight to d5, but after b4, guarding the horse on the rim, knight c3, and queen d2, I simply couldn't come up with a satisfactory move here, because if I go bishop g4, which is the top computer line, now white takes the pawn on b7, and material is even. Apparently, after queen b6, it's still equal, but very, very hard to play this, because now I've given back the material, and even a move like knight c5 to me looks fine, although apparently after rook a d8, I'm better. But it's really hard to go for this. So I spent a lot of time here. Fortunately, I found bishop h6 as I spent a lot of time trying to make knight d5 work. When I didn't, I was close to playing knight d7, but luckily I did spot this move, bishop to h6, which is an all-star move. I attacked the rook on c1, but more importantly, the rook does not have a good square on the c file. If white plays rook to c2, for example, now I can go d3, rook c3, and d2, and suddenly I've got this very advanced d pawn that's guarded by both the queen and the bishop here, and I'm much better. And if white plays the move rook to c5, which is probably what you would expect, now I can play knight to d7, attacking the rook on c5, but also now the knight on a5 is under fire. If you move the rook away, you lose the horse in the game. And if you play the move rook to d5, I can go e6, attacking the rook, rook to b5. Now I go a6, attacking the rook. White has to take on b7, and after queen c7, with both the rook and the b under attack here, white is going to lose material and the game. So Magnus plays the move rook to a1 after a long think, 50 seconds. And this is a game where both of us are really relying on our ability to move with limited time on the clock, because we have both spent nearly all our time on the first 17 moves. Now, after rook a1, I play the move d3, and now you see why bishop h6 is such a great piece here. Not only does it stop moves like knight g5, but it also now supports the pawn thrust to d2. There's no rook c1 on the c file. At this point, I am much better and close to winning. So Magnus goes b4. Now I play the move rook to b8. This is a move that I played pretty quickly. Quite simply, I want to guard the pawn. I'd love to move the b away to, say, f5 or even g4, but then white will simply take the pawn on b7, and I have nothing at all. So I go rook b8 to guard the pawn, so now I can release the bishop and move it to one of these three squares on the diagonal. And here Magnus plays move h4. Now this is a big mistake from Magnus, but at this point we're both low on time, and it makes sense that he's trying to move quick. So he goes h4. I play bishop g4, pinning the tail on the donkey. He plays queen b3, and now I go for the move d2. And now with these bishops on these diagonals here, at this point I should be winning the game. Magnus plays rook d1, and now I go e6. This is a move that I played pretty quickly as well, simply because I thought after queen d7, maybe there would be some e6 trick at some point. Now here it doesn't work, but I just thought, why give this pawn another square to push to when I can lock it up? It becomes a weakness in the endgame, and white still cannot do anything on the d file. So Magnus goes queen a2 here, and now I play queen to d3. Magnus plays rook takes pawn. Worth pointing out here that I probably should have traded the bishop for the knight, because after takes, and queen d3 here, now the pawn on d2 cannot really be captured. I actually thought Magnus could play bishop b7, but apparently here I have knight to a4, jumping to c3 with the fork, and at this point I should be winning the game. Instead, I play queen d3 pretty quickly, also trying to move quickly, press Magnus hard on the clock, and I figure, well, I'm going to win the knight on f3, or I'm going to win the rook on d1. Now Magnus sacks the rook. The rook takes pawn. I take, and I go bishop f5. Now bishop f5 is a mistake here. The computer actually wants rook fd8, knight to e4, and I guess bishop f3 is winning. But with knight c5 and D's knights getting super active here, really hard to go for this, honestly. And I thought that I should play bishop f5. So I take away the jump to e4. There's no access to either c5, d6, or f6 in this position. Now here Magnus plays move knight takes pawn, and this is not the best move. Computer says after knight b3, trying to go knight c5 and use D's knights. White should still be worse, but there is some counterplay. Instead, we get knight takes pawn on b7, and now I play the move knight to a4. An important move here because I take away knight to c5, and now Magnus blunders with the move knight c4. Now, Magnus only has 3 seconds on the clock, so I can't really be critical, but even here, the computer says after knight b3 with knight c5, white is worse, but it is not game over. Magnus instead plays knight c4, trying to jump to d6 with D's knights, but unfortunately now I have the crushing move knight to c3, and here I attack the queen on a2, but more importantly, if the queen moves away, I win the horse, and I'm going to win the game, as we'll see. Now, the other move that white can play is queen to b3 here, but then I have knight e2, checking the king and creating the classic fossil, and after king h2, queen takes b3, I'm up a queen, and I better win the game. So Magnus goes queen d2, I take the horse, and now at this point, I'm simply up a rook, and at this point, I'm also up 15 seconds on the clock, 17-2, so if I can't win this, when am I ever going to beat Magnus? So he goes knight d6. Now I play queen c7 here, retreating the queen. And in this position, we get the move h5 being played. Now, if Magnus were to play rook c1, trying to pin the knight here and win either the knight or the queen, I can play knight to e2 check, forking the king and the rook. And after takes, king h2, let's just say, I don't know, queen takes a3 here. I have 2 rooks and a bishop for a bishop and a knight. And unless white gets a magic lolly mate on g7, this will be over. So Magnus goes h5. Now I play knight to b5, trying to eliminate the great horse on d6. Magnus plays rook c1, I go queen to e7, and now we get the move rook c5. Now here I play the move rook to d8, pinning the knight on d6. Magnus goes h6, I trade, and I take on d6. Now, as long as I don't get lolly mated on g7 here, I will win the game. Game continues with queen c3. I play queen to d4. Obviously, I'm happy to trade the queens. And here, Magnus rather regrettably has to trade. If he moves the queen to any other square, either f3, e1, c1, or b3, any of these squares, I always have queen to d1, forcing the queens off the board no matter what white does. Queen f3, queen d1, queen b3, queen d1. I guess queen b3 is queen c5 as well. Queen c1, queen d1, and queen e1, queen d1. So queens are coming off the board, and now it's clear that I am going to win the game. We get the trade. Magnus plays rook c7. Here I go a5. Magnus takes, and now I go rook to a4, trying to split the pawns and win them. And without any other material, no knights, no queens, even though it looks dangerous around the king with a lone pawn here, white cannot do anything. Magnus goes rook c5. I play bishop e4, trying to close the diagonal and force the bishops off the board. We get bishop f1. I go king f8 here. And at this point, Magnus Carlsen resigns the game here because, quite simply, I'm bringing the king to the center. I have ideas like rook to b1 to pin the bishop. And with an extra rook on the board, there's simply no chance for Magnus to survive. So I get this epic win against Magnus in round 9 to move into a shared tie for first place with 8 points out of 9. And in round 10, I am paired against none other than the future first American world champion, Hans Niemann, once again. So today's Title Tuesday, very reminiscent of the Speed Chess Championship. Magnus, of course, beat Hans badly in that event. I did too. And Magnus beats Hans in this Title Tuesday, and will history repeat in my game as well? Well, let's see. So I get another black, second black in a row, and Hans plays move e4. I go e5, we get knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, we get d3, knight f6, c3, and I play the move d6. Hans castles, I play h6, we get rook e1 castles, knight d2, bishop b6, h3, and now I play the move a5. Now, all this is very standard. That's why I went through the moves very quickly. This, of course, is the classic Gucci piano opening, which Hans has played a lot in recent times. He's done very well with it. In the Speed Chess Championship, he beat Wesley So. I think he got some great positions against Anish Giri in their match as well. So it's probably the system that Hans knows the best. But in general, it's also a very solid system for black. So Hans plays the move bishop b3 here. The reason, by the way, that I played a5 is quite simple. I want to stop white from expanding on the queen side. So we get bishop b3. I go bishop e6, trying to contest the diagonal with the two b's. And here Hans plays the move bishop a4. Now I play this move knight d7. And this might look a little bit unusual to you guys, but the reason I play knight d7 is twofold. First of all, let's just say white plays a move like, I don't know, rook f1. Potentially, I can play knight c5, forking the bishop and the pawn. But also, I'm intending to play f5 here, trying to open up this f file and attack towards the white king. So Hans goes for the move knight f1. Now I play f5, trying to use the classic dark square b and the rook on the open lane here and create some chaos. Hans trades. I take with the bishop. Not rook takes, by the way, because after rook takes, I think here white is d4, and there's some issues with the bishop being on e6, or so I recall. So I play the move bishop takes pawn instead. Hans goes knight g3, and now I go bishop to g6 here, opening up the file for the rook and spying the pawn on f2. Hans plays d4, trying to shut down the bishop on this diagonal, and here I play the move pawn takes pawn. Hans plays pawn takes, and now I play the move knight to b4. Now this move is simply a blunder here. It's not an obvious blunder, mind you, but it's a blunder because in this position, white has a very devious sack that I frankly think nobody would find unless they know the specific variation. Now, the reason I played knight b4 is I thought, well, I'm going for d3, maybe c2. Additionally, I have a nice square on d5. Like, hypothetically, if I can stabilize this knight on d5, I'm just going to make some random moves here to illustrate the point. If I can stabilize this knight, I have a really nice bastion, and white always has a pawn on d4 that is a serious weakness. So I go knight b4. And in this position, Hans has this very nasty move, bishop takes h6. And after sacking the bishop and going for rook to e6, apparently after knight f6 and queen d2, with these knights so close to the king side and the kebab on the 6th rank, apparently white is actually much better. After bishop f7, white can sack the rook with rook e1, takes. And I guess after knight h7, check, king h8, rook takes h6, black can resack the rook. And after queen e7, a3, knight d5, bishop b3, white's apparently much better here. Don't ask me what this line is. Frankly, it looks ridiculous. And I think if anybody finds this, even in classical chess, they deserve to win, because this is frankly 3,500 level chess, which is just not human at all. So Hans, like a human, plays the move bishop b3 check. Now I go king to h8, and we get to move bishop e3. Now here I play the move knight to f6, trying to put my knight on either d5 or maybe even go knight e4 down the road. Hans plays queen d2, and now I play this very aggressive move a4. Now, this is an extremely provocative move because in this position, I could play a move like bishop to h7 to consolidate my king side and dodge any real sacks. If white takes here, for example, takes queen h6, now I can play knight to g8, forcing the queen away, and then I think after rook f3, takes, and queen f6, black should be winning with the two b's for the rook. Instead, I play a4, very provocative move, and now Hans plays bishop d1. Now, the computer here says that after knight to h4, bishop h7, and bishop takes h6. Very, very messy situation again with takes, knight f5. Apparently, after takes, king here, and queen b4, black is very slightly better. I really have no idea what's going on. b3 is weak. There's rook e7 with a kebab. Very, very hard to play. And also what I would say about this position is that in this situation, both of us have used a little bit of time. With 2+ minutes, you have to make a very, very situational decision where either you use a lot of time and try to find the killer blow or the best line, or you try to move quickly and play on instinct. And I think in this situation, without knowing that these sacrifices are good for white, it's almost impossible to do it. And that's why Hans plays the move bishop d1. Now I play the move bishop to a5, and this is probably the best move here as I'm threading all kinds of fossils and forks. Now let's just say white were to go king h1 here. I have knight to d3 here, hitting the queen and the rook on the diagonal. I also have knight c2, forking the two towers while hitting the queen and the rook once again, and it's very, very dangerous. Now the drawback to playing bishop a5 here is that it forces Hans to go for the sack with bishop takes pawn. And at this point, I have 2 minutes on the clock, but it's very tricky because now I have to look for concrete calculations. And frankly, after having streamed all day and this being the 10th round, my brain turns to mush here. Now, I spent a lot of time thinking, couldn't figure it out, and I ended up making a mistake, but I'll show what the correct line is. Now, one of the lines I did consider was knight to d3, attacking the rook and the queen on the diagonal. I saw queen to g5 here, and after takes, queen takes h6. Apparently, knight h7, I'm simply much better here. I think I also thought maybe there was queen g6, knight e1, and some kind of trick like knight f5 maybe or something, but I guess there's knight f3 check, and then simply queen d7, covering the mate on g7. Takes, I have queen h7, and I'm winning. I did consider lines like this, but I simply couldn't work it out. And I also thought there might even be bishop takes pawn, takes, and queen g5 as well. Because here, if I take the rook, sorry, I played knight e1 or bishop e1. Now I think white is knight to h4 with knight f5, and suddenly my bishop on g6 is hanging. And it's apparently bishop d2 is drawing the game according to the computer. But all this is way too chaotic, and simply everything is spiraling out of control. And I cannot calculate this with the limited amount of time I have. So I end up playing this move knight to h7. And this is a move that is probably, it's obviously not the best move. But if I'm going to play knight h7, I should play it after using 25 to 30 seconds. Because now when I play knight h7, not only is it a bad move, and that I've given away the advantage, but I'm now also down 1.5 minutes on the clock as well. So Hans goes rook to e6. I play the move knight to d5, which is a mistake here, by the way. I should have played rook f6 right away. So after takes, and let's say bishop e3. Now I have knight c2, hitting the rook and the queen at the same time. So after rook e6, I play the move knight to d5 after another long think of 20 seconds. And this is simply a blunder. Now, the reason I played this move is I figured if I can get a knight to f6 or a rook to f6, I stabilize. Additionally, I have a knight on d5. I've got a nice bastion. So long term, even though I'm missing a pawn on the king side, I think I can save the game. Now, Hans spends a long time here before playing the move queen c1, spending 1.5 minutes before playing this move. Computer actually says that white should sack the queen with rook takes bishop. And after taking the queen, bishop g7 and king g8, white apparently can go, wait, check king here. And apparently bishop takes d2, and white's much better. That's not what I expected, which is why I'm kind of speechless. Obviously, I haven't looked at the game super closely before doing this recap. Apparently, white's better with the 2Bs for the queen, but I'm going to be honest. Again, sacking the queen and just playing positionally is not something that any human is going to do here. I'm actually really shocked. So the line that I considered during the game when Hans was thinking for a long time was there might be a bishop f6 check, king f7 takes, and I thought after king g6 here I was surviving because here white has sacked a rook. White has a bishop in return for the rook on h8, but I thought after like bishop h4 and maybe bishop f4 I'm fine, although apparently after check, king h8, a3, of course, white is much better. a3, another ridiculous computer move that makes no sense. But I thought I was okay. So Hans doesn't go for this after the long think. He plays the move queen to c1 instead, and now I play the move rook f6. Unfortunately for me, it's one move too late because I need this knight jumping towards either d3 or c2 versus having the bastion with the knight on d5. Hans trades, and he goes bishop d2. At this point, white is simply up a pawn on the king side, and I really have no counterplay at all here. All I can do is move quickly and hope to confuse the situation. So I go bishop b6. But the one good thing I will point out is Hans has burned his whole time advantage. So now we're in a situation with less than 30 seconds on the clock, and if I can get Hans low on time, there's a chance he can still blunder, because even though I'm not as fast as I once was, people will make mistakes low on time in such situations, unless their name is, of course, Alireza Firouzja. So we get the move bishop c2. Now I go knight to f8, knight e4. I go queen e7, knight g5 here. And at this point, I'm completely lost, as now my king is very weak. These knights on f3 and g5 support each other. They're probably going to be all kinds of mates around the king. And I'm really just hoping that maybe I can get Hans to blunder. So I go queen f6. We get trade. I take with the queen. Hans plays queen c4. I go c6, consolidating my bastion. But now after rook e1, Hans controls the e file. Regrettably, I cannot play rook e8 here to contest it because after takes, and queen a4, now I'm simply down 2 pawns, one on the king side, one on the queen side, and it's all but hopeless. So after rook e1, I go a3. Hans takes. I play rook takes a3, and now we get the move queen e2. Here I play the move king to g8. Keep in mind here that I'm really struggling. I'm down 20 seconds. I'm simply trying to avoid blundering mate in 1. So I go king g8. Hans plays knight h4. Now I go queen to h6. This is a mistake, by the way. I should have gone to f6. In fact, I'm not sure why I didn't go here. I think I thought after queen f6, maybe queen h5 is winning. But apparently here, I have g6, queen e2, and I guess I can just take on a2. And maybe white's still better. Something like this would have been possible. But with limited time on the clock, I'm just moving fast. I know that if I get down to 1 or 2 seconds, I won't be able to move quick enough to avoid flagging on time. So I go queen h6. Hans plays queen e8 here, and now I play the move queen to f6. Worth pointing out, if I take the horse, white has queen f7 check, king h8, queen takes f8 checkmate, and I lose the game. So I go for queen f6. Hans plays rook to e6, and this is a move that actually is completely wrong. At this point, if white plays almost anything, knight f3, for example, maybe I was going to say maybe even this knight to f3, maybe it's not best, but if white goes knight f3 here, white's winning. But Hans goes for rook e6 thinking that he's winning the game here because where can my queen go? If I take the pawn, it's the same checkmate with queen f7, queen h8. I have no other squares on the f file in this position. f5, f4, f3, everything is covered, so I should be losing. However, I have this one resource, which is knight to c7, forking the rook and the queen, and suddenly out of nowhere, I'm back in the game. Hans takes the queen, I take the queen on e8, and here D's knights are perfect. Knight guards the pawn, f8 guards e6, and Hans goes rook f7. Now here I take on d4. Hans plays knight to f5, trying to use D's knights to get towards my king and attack the bishop on d4. Play bishop f6, only move, by the way. If I go bishop e5, there's knight e7 check. This knight guards the rook. And after king h8, rook f8, it's the same checkmate where the king is stuck on h8. So I play bishop f6 here, covering the e7 square. And now Hans plays the move rook takes pawn. Here I go rook takes a2, and now we get to move knight e4. Now, I will give Hans a lot of credit. At this point, he's kind of blown the advantage, but he still finds very good moves. It would be very easy to move the bishop to, say, e3 here, and after takes and something like c5, white is still better, but material is even here, and I have very, very good chances to draw. But Hans finds knight e4, guarding the bishop on d2, but attacking the bishop and the knight at the bishop and the pawn at the same time. Here I play the move bishop e5, and this is a blunder. Keep in mind, I've got 6 seconds left. Nothing I can really do. Computer wants knight to e6, and I guess after takes, bishop c3 and c5, maybe I'm still in the game, but playing this, I think, is frankly insane. So, after knight to e4, I go bishop e5, trying to make sure that the wooden shield guards both of the pawns on g7 and d6. Hans plays f4, and now I go back to f6. Hans takes the bishop. I take with the pawn, of course. So I take with the knight. After takes, king h8, and bishop c3, I'm getting killed on this diagonal. So I take with the pawn, and now Hans plays the move bishop e3. Here I go c5, trying to stop white from playing bishop d4 and putting pressure on the diagonal, and Hans plays the move rook e7, which misses a simple win in this position. If Hans were to play check, king h8, and rook to b8 here, he would win one of D's knights. I can still go king g7, but after takes, now white is an extra bishop. At any rate, this would have simply been winning here because I'm going to lose some material on the back rank. Instead, we get rook e7. At this point, it's just a dogfight. Both of us very low on time, and you're just trying to make moves. So I go rook a8, guarding the knight on e8, and now we get the move knight h6, king h8, and here Hans plays the move f5. Now, you will notice material is even. Both sides have the same number of pieces. I've got 2 knights versus bishop knight. Both have a rook, and we both have 3 pawns. But the problem is D's knights on f8 and e8 are very passive. On the other hand, however, I have a very straightforward plan of trying to push my p in the center. If I can get the p down the board, I maybe can create some chances and win the game. So here I go knight to h7, and the reason I play knight h7 in this position is quite simply I want to maybe try to activate the knight to g5. Here, computer wants rook ch, just going all in for c4, c3, c2 right away, but I play knight h7. Hans goes h4 here, trying to box the knight here from going to g5, and now I play rook c8. Hans goes g4. Here I play the move d5. We got g5, and now I go d4, trying to race with the pawns. Hans plays g6, and now I go knight to f8. And in this position, Hans Niemann, with 1 second on the clock, runs out of time and flags, and I get a miracle win in this 10th round against Hans. Now, white is winning here with knight check, king g8, and apparently h5 is the winning line here. I was expecting Hans to go bishop f4, but after bishop f4 and knight g7, it's a very tricky situation here because white can't push h5. If white isn't careful and you go knight f7 and, I don't know, king f2, Now you lose the pawn on f5, then you lose the pawn on g6, and you lose the game as well. So honestly, I thought if we got to this position with knight g7, it's very, very chaotic, very unclear what's going on. Computer gives the best line. I think it's h5 takes and rook f7, because now if I take the bishop, there's g7, king h7, actually, king h7, g takes f8, which is checkmate, oddly enough. And if I play knight g7 back, now there's rook f6, knight f5, knight f5. And I guess white is winning in this position. It's very, very chaotic. I don't really know if Hans would have been able to find it, frankly. And if I were to play c4 here, now there's bishop to d6, threatening the knight on f8. And white has ideas like rook h7 checkmate as well. So if this had happened in the game, I still think there's a very good chance that I would have won here, simply because I have a very obvious plan of pushing the p with c4, c3, d3, d2, and so forth. And the rook is behind the pawn, and it guards the knight. But we don't get to see what happens because Hans simply doesn't have good enough mouse skills, or maybe simply chess.com glitched on him like it did during the Speed Chess Championship. At any rate, I get a huge win in round number 10. That means that going to the final round, I'm tied for first place with Magnus on 9 out of 10. Now, in round 11, Magnus would beat Bogdan Deac, a 2,700 level player from Romania. I was only able to draw a little bit luckily against Daniel Naroditsky to finish in second place. Even if I had won that game, I still would not have gotten first on tiebreak. So as it is, Magnus ends up winning the title Tuesday. I get second place. But I thought all three of these games would be very hype as history repeats itself. And Magnus and I show once again why Hans is simply not likely to become the first American future world chess champion. All right. So on that note, I hope you guys enjoyed this recap from the late title Tuesday. Today, September 24th of the year 2024. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with some more great recaps in the very near future. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you very soon. See you. Bye.